cannot be here today, but he kindly provided us with his presentation and his paper, which will be read by me. Eduardo Carrero Santamaria is a professor for art history and musicology at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. He obtained his PhD at the University of Madrid in 1999. And the title of his presentation is The Elusive Function of Post-Carolingian Architecture, Liturgy and Sound in Benedictine Contexts. I will read this, and of course we can afterwards discuss this paper. Only if you have questions concerning the content, maybe I'm not the correct addressee, since I'm not actually aware of what I'm going to read now. With the expression nebuleuse cluniesienne, Dominique Ignota-Prat refers to a sphere of influence in which Cluny's presence can be preserved in various ways, without implying direct institutional dependence, and even less the application of the broad and often imprecise label cluniac. By contrast, when applied to all spheres of the liturgical phenomenon, the adjective cluniac generally serves as an accurate descriptor of the effective dissemination of a liturgical model formulated at the abbey, which, once assimilated, transformed and adapted, could function with a much wider context that might ultimately bear little direct connection to Cluny itself, responding instead to the specific needs of another monastic community. In terms of liturgy, the Cluniac has a clear identity conflict. Among other things, this is due to its temporal expression and the intentions behind its drafting. The abbey produced a collection of liturgical books comprising different libri ordinarii, that is, manuals for the staging of the liturgy that followed one another over time, written for one reason or another. Always linked to the memory of a particular abbacy, they are an example of the ritual expression of worship in the abbey at a specific moment in time, revealing a diachronic development of its own that affected both the ceremonial and the parallel ecological corpus. Thus, the Cluniac liturgy of the Consuetudines Antiquiores differs from that of the Liber Tramitis. The first was dated to 990, the second to 1027, or between 1027 and 1048. Just as the internal ordinary of the monk Bernhard in 1060 is different from that which his contemporary Ulrich wrote to describe the liturgy of the monastery to the abbot of Hirsau. Also, the Cluniac nature of the regulations of Abbot Peter the Venerable during the 12th century differs from the other liturgical sources up to the modern times. All of these are Cluniac regulations, and therefore the liturgy developed in the houses under their influence participated in these chronological variations. It is neither more or less than the distance between the old and young Cluny that Hallinger defined liturgically in 1959, the evolution of the rite, its internal changes, and its practical needs. But there is something important and extremely serious in studies on liturgy and its relationship with architecture and acoustics. Cluny did not work ex novo. The monumental rite it developed was based on the pre-existing one in the previous Carolingian abbeys, from where the Burgundian monastery took it and amplified it. In the houses where the Cluniac ways of doing things arrived, these ancient rules were preserved and practiced and could be replaced by the new extended rite or adapted to their own needs and possibilities. The observance of Cluniac practices came to be seen as a sign of good practice for an abbey. Liturgical regulations are open to modification, glossing, marginal commentary, deletions, and additions that removed or incorporated actions, rites, prayers, or chants. Cluny's rules were also altered by later hands. For example, Peter the Venerable reduced the signing after the antiphons on some feast days to avoid boredom, tedium, and because this custom was not observed in monasteries outside Cluny and its immediate geographical sphere of influence. But customs were also modified in the places where they were received. In fact, the liturgical accelerance of Cluny led to the frequent presence of monks who traveled there to study it in order to reform their own abbey, or prompted the commissioning of texts that collected the ordo to show it elsewhere. Remember that the oldest pieces of Cluny liturgy are preserved from Italian copies, such as those of Galeata or Fafa. These formative or descriptive codices established ways of life for transmission, but served more as a source of inspiration than as common regulations. The books of customs of other Reformist and later orders, such as the Cistercians or Carthusians, perfected this method of dissemination and enshrined it in vertical standard regulations. In contrast, the Cluniac directories were a model, a framework on which to organize a liturgy. No, it's Fafa. It's Fafa. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I start this sentence again. I apologize. The books of customs of other Reformist and later orders perfected this method of dissemination and enshrined it in vertical standard regulations. In contrast, the Cluniac directions were a model, a framework on which to organize a liturgy that took its own course in each place. Jean Leclerc pointed out the flexibility with which they were put into practice. As the customs of Uldaric refer to, the abbot had the final say on what and how it should be celebrated. Therefore, if the St. Gall plan showed the planimetric organization of an ideal monastery, which could be interpreted and altered in many ways depending on a myriad of variables, a Cluniac liturgical directory exported to another monastery was a source for its ceremonial organization, among other things, because the material reality of Cluny, that is, the physical setting in which the liturgy was to be performed, was difficult to imitate elsewhere. This serves to emphasize that, in liturgical terms, the Cluniac nebula is full of possible nuances, too complex or casuistic to be established as a general rule. It is an area where subtleties outweighed the possibility of establishing common rules of study, because each case requires its own analysis. Cluniac liturgical practices in the Iberian Peninsula. While in Old Catalonia, the presence of the Cluniac monastic reform was felt during the time of Abbot Oliba, when some monasteries were placed under his influence, in the rest of the peninsula, the fact that the change from the Old Hispanic liturgy to the Roman Rite coincided with the greatest splendor of Cluny led to the twinning of the rule of Saint Benedict, the Roman Rite, and the Cluniac presence. Faced with this tabula rasa, other studies have demonstrated the need to reconsider the unique characteristics of each territory. For monasteries such as San Juan de la Peña, there had been an overly simplistic identification between the adoption of the Roman liturgy, the reception of the rule of Saint Benedict, and entry into the Cluniac sphere of influence. In fact, interventions in monastic reform in the center and west of the peninsula appear to follow two clearly defined interpretative lines. On the one hand, the undeniable presence of Cluny, which not only shaped liturgical reform but also fostered a distinctive imported cultural landscape. On the other hand, a separate current of reform originating elsewhere, identified by Charles J. Bishko in 1968 and Derek W. Lomax in 1982, whose liturgical dimension has since been clarified by Juan Pablo Rubio. All this interest in defining the difficulties, triggers, and responsibilities involved in the liturgical change from Hispanic to Roman has meant that interest in books on customs has not been excessive. Thus, in the early decades of the 20th century, no peninsular book appeared in the 5 volumes edited by Bruno Albers, which contained a selection of monastic customs. In a monumental corpus Consuetudinum Monasticarum, initiated by Cassius Hallinger, books of customs from peninsular monasteries do not appear before 1431. With the ordinances of the late Benedictine monastery Calabazanos, some statutes of San Benito el Real de Valladolid, some customs of Montserrat from the 15th and 16th century, and some customs of Ripoll dating from 1835. Does this mean that there were no peninsular Benedictine ordinaries prior to the 15th century? Logically, yes. After Jaime and Joaquín Lorenzo Villanueva insisted on the importance of some of these Benedictine codices around 1800, scholars have taken a keen interest in the publication of specific examples such as those of Sant Cugat de Baix and Santa Maria de Pombeiro. Meanwhile, art historians have used them as a tool for the functional analysis of space. Recent rereadings of archival collections and, in particular, the review of inventories and bookshop catalogs highlight a growing field of analysis. The Consuetudines from Ripoll, which Hallinger had erroneously dated to the 19th century, had been recorded by Prospero Bofarul among the holdings of his archive according to Valls y Taberner. There were 3 entries under the heading of Consuetudas and Ceremonials from the 12th and 13th century. Alongside these, he also refers to a Ceremoniale Sancti Odilonis from the 12th and 13th centuries, which he does not hesitate to identify as a book of customs from Cluny, and other miscellaneous pieces. Lost after the secularization and partial loss of the archive following the fire of 1835, Marc Sureda has rescued a late 13th century processional order collected in a later codex and fragments of the books of customs copied at the beginning of the 19th century, preserved in the archive of the Crown of Aragon and the Big Cathedral Archive. Meanwhile, the Barcelona Cathedral preserves a beautiful tabula of monastic offices in the Cluny style, which may have belonged to the priories of San Ponce de Corbera or San Pere de Clara, as Miguel Gros reasoned. Much later, in the inventory of the books of San Pere de Rodez, there appear some constitutions of the German Benedictine congregation Brufeldense, founded in the 15th century, sharing a library with several copies of the constitutions of the cloistered congregation of Tarragona, Cesa Augusta, and that of San Benito el Real in Valladolid. The preservation of these latter books in San Pere de Rodez is important in terms of preserving medieval liturgical memory. From the late Middle Ages onwards, the reform of Benedictine monasticism led to the founding of 3 Benedictine congregations on the Iberian Peninsula: the Tarragona Cesar Augustan congregation, the San Benito el Real congregation in Valladolid, and the Black Monks of San Benito in Portugal, which respectively imposed common modes of celebration. The Book of Ceremonies of the Valladolid congregation was an ordinary with a complex gestation, which left preliminary handwritten codifications until its final publication in 1599. This establishment of common liturgical rules for its members is a new and different chapter from the one we are dealing with here, but I would like to emphasize that from its inception, the customs of the congregation acted as a veritable steamroller against previous practices, so that we can assume that its old codices were largely relegated or forgotten, replaced by the general forms drafted by the congregation. Given this situation, the possibility remains open of discovering new books of Benedictine customs in any type of archive that could broaden our vision. If we are to recognize the relevance of a much broader liturgical landscape than had previously been assumed, the available information does not allow us to establish parameters that show the degree of Cluniac influence on the peninsula based on the adoption of liturgical books. On the other hand, its liturgical geography is very capricious. We saw how Ripoll, a monastery not originally linked to Cluny, had among its book collections customs from the time of Abbot Odo. Something similar occurs with St. Thugat, whose ordinary from around 1218 is clearly inspired by Burgundian customs. Meanwhile, in Aragon, the liturgical books of a monastery traditionally considered the head of Cluniac monasticism, such as San Juan de la Peña, demonstrate its real distance from the abbey. The breviary dated between the 14th and 15th centuries, shelfmark Royal Library of the Monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial, manuscript F, Roman 4:26, is a clear example of the irrelevant liturgical influence of Cluny compared to Catalan and Aquitanian influences. It is more than interesting that the Codex itself announces that it contains a breviary and a psalter according to its own customs, secundum consuetudinem Pinatensis. The Benedictine abbots of the Iberian Peninsula seem to have wavered between a Cluniac organizational structure mixed with other traditions. In this regard, we may find some insight in an astute observation made at the Cluniac General Chapter of 1290, which stated that the geographical distance between Cluny and the monks of Spain, Germany, England, and Lombardy meant that, despite being similar, their customs were different. Amoribus ecclesiae cluniacensis in multis discrepant, et dum accedunt quandoque ad Cluniacum grave videtur eis dem moribus Cluniaci conformare. The architectural imprint, chancers, Galilea's external chapels. That's the title of the next chapter. If, from the perspective of the liturgical book, the Cluniac imprint in Iberia is a labyrinth of political and liturgical geographies that is difficult to manage, from the material reality of the monasteries, we must ask ourselves whether the implementation of a Cluniac liturgy required specific spaces that made the monastery different from other Benedictine houses. A synthesis of the general opinion in this subject can be found in the interpretation of Charles B. McClendon, who argues that the reconstruction of Farfa, carried out at the same time as the copying of the monastery manuscript that contains the Liber Tramitis Cluniacensis, may have represented a local adaptation of the Cluny building described therein. Following this principle of direct inspiration and, on occasions, prestigious reference to the architecture of the Great Abbey, the multidirectional interpretation of architecture as a material expression of liturgical rites has led to some elements present in monastic architecture between the 10th and 11th centuries being described as Cluniac. Here I will focus on the development of a type of church east end and the Galileas that were built at its west end. In all cases, these elements are justified by the liturgy. Big and complex east end that favored the independence of multiple celebrations. Porches as two-story structures of the funerals and the starting point of processions. At the beginning of the 20th century, searching for a model of a Benedictine church, Henri Lefebvre-Pontellier drew up an indirect exegesis of the building that would initially have been influenced by the Church of Cluny too, insisting on the scheme of a shevet with semicircular and stepped apsis opening onto a wide transept which characterized the Church of Cluny too, later revealed by Kenneth J. Contant. On this occasion, the architecture serves as an example of a functional evolution linked to the liturgy. In a seminal article, Isidro Bango theorized brilliantly that the east end of San Miquel de Huixa, built in the 10th century, repeated the layout of Cluny too, and that this formal link may have been related to the introduction of Cluniac practices in the monastery at the time the church was built. Widely accepted by later authors, Bangho's impression was based on a planimetric comparison between the two churches, which, when placed on a real scale and updated with the latest information on Cluny too, clearly falls apart. Beyond these formal relationships, recent interventions at Cluny, together with a subsequent reassessment of Conant's conclusions regarding its construction phases, highlight the challenges inherent in interpreting a shevet that underwent at least 3 phases of functional alteration and that, logically, may also have been revised in the buildings influenced by it. Something similar happens with the Galilei structures, complex structures built at the foot of churches whose lower and upper floors could have been the setting for funeral celebrations, moments of the liturgy, of the hours, of specific festivities on the calendar. José Luis Senra has explained how the elevation of Western structures did not necessarily originate in Cluny, but rather enjoyed a previous Iberian Peninsula tradition. It should also be noted that an abbey belonging to the Cluniac sphere did not necessarily include a Galilei, just as a monastery operating outside that liturgical milieu might, in fact, have incorporated one. Thus, in the Catalan counties, some of the most important Cluniac monasteries, such as San Pere de Cáceres, did not have a Galilei. Meanwhile, the non-Cluniac monastery of San Pere de Rodes had a substantial Galilei, well documented through archaeological evidence. The Book of Customs of the Portuguese monastery of Santa Maria de Pombeiro, ceded to Cluny in 1108, is a clear adaptation of the Cluniac Ordo of 1070. However, at no point does it refer to the physical space of a Galilei reminiscent of Burgundian architecture. In fact, it was not until the 13th century that the construction of one was recorded, which we must understand as a funeral portico following a local tradition. Meanwhile, non-Cluniac institutions such as San Pere de Rodes and Sant Cugat de Baix had preserved or documented Galilei porticos. In contrast to these dubious realities, in the institutions that made up the Cluniac strip that developed between La Rioja, Burgos, and Palencia, the architectural entity of the Galilei in the churches of Sahagún, San Isidro de Dueñas, San Zoilo de Carrión, de los Condes, and San Martín de Fromista, even taking into account its specificity, especially clear in Sahagún, cannot be separated from its connection to Cluny. In fact, it seems clear that in medieval Castile there was an awareness of the Galilei as a representative element of Cluniac architecture. The Codex Rico de las Cantigas de Santa Maria depicts a section of the entrance door and the Galilei of the Church of Cluny, where the miracles take place. A two-story structure houses the monks of the upper floor singing vespers, while the laity are confined to the lower floor. Regardless of the reality of the liturgical moment depicted, the context of the image serves to identify the Burgundian abbey through an architectural element that represents it, namely the Galilei. Some final thoughts. What has traditionally been understood as Cluniac architecture is, in reality, a much more complex phenomenon where political, institutional, artistic, liturgical, and spatial factors converge. Cluny's influence was not expressed solely through the literal copying of its architectural forms or rituals, but rather these were reinterpreted and adapted according to local contexts, previous traditions, and specific needs. The adoption of the Cluniac ordines did not necessarily imply the complete implementation of its liturgy, nor the exact reproduction of its architectural spaces. The legacy of Carolingian monasticism, together with local realities, conditioned both liturgical practices and architectural forms, giving rise to a wide variety of formal solutions. Consider the Cluniac Church of Santa Maria dell'Alto, which a westernized church and a complex counter facade that reveals a liturgical ritual of its own, far removed from Cluniac norms. Thus, elements such as chevets, ambulatory, or Galilei were not exclusive to Cluny, nor were they informally adopted by its affiliated monasteries. Monasteries outside the congregation also incorporated practices or forms considered Cluniac, revealing the breadth and permeability of the phenomenon. This diversity confirms that there was no strictly Cluniac or Benedictine architectural style in the strict sense. On the contrary, heterogeneity was its defining feature, even within its most influential branches. What, then, can be said about the acoustics of their churches? Seeing a defining sound beyond the strictly musical relationship inherent in chant thus appears to be an exercise that is as straightforward as it is devoid of meaning. Each Benedictine monastery not only developed liturgical practices shaped by its own history, but also possessed a particular architectural configuration and a specific monastic community, comparing the potential soundscape of any of the faces of the Church of Cluny with that of any other monastery, whether or not it belonged to the Cluniac congregation, does not seem to be an approach likely to yield shared or common conclusions. So the floor is open for comments, and I would like you in the back to tell me if somebody comments on YouTube, on the YouTube stream, that we do not overlook this. But for those in the room, are there any comments? Yeah.
Which is that of course, we're all very sad that he couldn't be with us today. Force majeure, as they say. I mean, it's really interesting, of course, because it's something I've never reflected on, because I've never worked on Spain and Catalonia. But I think it's really interesting to see quite the level of Cluny influence and Cluniac influence in the peninsula, and as it seems like it wasn't that much. And as he said in the last sentence, heterogeneity is also a very defining feature. So in a sense, what we need as a project and as a team is also negative answers, you know, in a sense, you know, a contribution that say, no, there isn't, or no, there wasn't. And I think one of the things that struck me the most was that as far as musical notation is concerned, we see a trajectory that kind of, if we imagine the Pyrenees as a horizontal line, the part most close to the coast is the one that Septimania links Septimania with Catalonia. And that's very likely where things were happening in Carolingian times. But it seems like instead the axis kind of moved a bit to the west later on in the 11th century and 12th century, and connecting much more what was Aquitania with north of Aragon, perhaps. As a musicologist, I never worked on that area. I just found it really interesting to think about. And indeed, if it's really the case, I don't know, maybe you would correct me if I'm wrong, but that was my interpretation, and I think this paper was very interesting in that respect.
Jeremy.
This may be known to people already, but there is a research project, or there was a research project at the University of Tübingen under Stefan Morent, also in the Polytechnic in Aachen, seeking to reconstruct the acoustics of the different Cluny buildings. So this is a project of so-called heritage acoustics, which went further than the usual projects so that they were able to perform with headphones in these different acoustics. And for those who are interested in chant scholarship, and I know that some people have worked on this, when we talk about a note being long or short and not thinking about the different acoustics at the same time and the effect of acoustics on paleography as well, this is you know, an interesting project of heritage acoustics.
Over there.
To add to this selection of interesting heritage acoustics projects, I think Karl Kügler did something with the Royal Chapel or Aristocratic Chapel of Valois, where they found out that stuff like wooden paneling matters a lot. And somebody did a project on the acoustics of Notre Dame in Paris, where it turned out that Notre Dame polyphony was likely feasible to listen to at certain tempo, thanks to also having banners for particular feasts. Seems like all these things are relevant to thinking about spaces.
Yeah, you can pass the microphone there. Thanks.
Thank you. You speak about some progetto and the manuscript article Aragon 46. And did you
about Chant
side? If my memory is correct, you can find
Chant
specific chants APAX on the single chants for Feast of Presentation in Paponte.
12th century, but it's very single, and it's Gregorian chant arriving in Spain, and there's elsewhere. Did you see that, or?
This was not my talk. I'm the replacement who was reading the talk. So this was actually Eduardo talk, and I personally was in the library of Sant Cugat 9 years ago, thanks to Matthias, but I wasn't able to see this particular manuscript. Yeah. Sant Cugat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, but he was asking about the one in Sant Cugat. Yeah. Any further comments? Yeah. If not, and if also no comments from the outside world receive us, then we will go on with our next speaker, who is Matthias Tischler, Matthias Tischler studied in Heidelberg and Munich. His PhD was supervised by Walter Berschin. He did his habilitation at the Technische Universität of Dresden, and he is now an ICREA research professor at the Universitat Autónoma in Barcelona. And he will talk today about brokers, hotspot, and networks, insights into the unknown Italo-Catalan texts and manuscript culture of the 10th and 11th century. The floor is yours, Matthias.
Thank you, Patrick. So, let's try to build a bridge. Oh no, here we are. Progettazione, no, presentazione. Dall'inizio. Tutto italiano. Okay. I had to learn Catalan. We have Catalan version of all that as well. Yeah, everything, Word, PowerPoint, and so on. Okay, fine. It's not all the paper. Do not fear, it's already an article. So, for first orientation, I do not comment. You can read for yourself. Thank you for being invited here and to talk to you, perhaps bringing things together. So I'm a bridge builder, so bringing the missing links together. I try to give an overview of what I found about on this Italo-Catalan relationship, perhaps entanglement of text and manuscripts, and focusing only on the 10th, 11th century, because from the 12th century onwards, you know, in the area of learned culture, so much is shifting with scholasticism. People are moving more and more, going to the international schools, northern France, but also in Italy. So with Bologna and Salerno and so on. And therefore, I cannot go up to the 12th and 13th century. As you know, the migration of the people, ideas, and cultural expressions, including texts and books, always fascinated us as philologists or historians. Regardless of the area, the question of the origins, brokers, and destinations of ancient and modern works has been raised, and attempts have been made to uncover the specific motivations behind this migration of culture, often caused by political, social, and religious upheavals. What you see here is not a new atomic model, but this, let's say, the essay to describe what happened in the last decades in this research area. As you know, we had this South-North relationship as a privileged one, certainly privileged also after Second World War with these Europeanizing new cultural studies of our grandfather's generation, who were really focused on the Carolingian epoch, post-Carolingian epoch, to understand the relationship between the old, late antique, early medieval world of the Mediterranean and the new uprising power of Central Europe with the Franks and the Carolingians. This is the red circle. Then we had more or less a little bit later, parallelly, the privileged relationship between Southwest and West, between the Iberian world and Gaul. You find here also the names of the protagonists who worked on this relationship, and a third one, the blue, and the third one, the yellow one, is the Italian-Iberian relationship, again with one of the protagonists, Diaz. But let's say in this movement, a smaller world which would be somehow the strategic region between all that, north, south, west, east, and so we come out somehow in a world which was that what following Mundo and Arturo, our paleographers, is the Septimanian Catalan world. And there's much more to be done in the future. So this tricky situation is that we have at least 3 smaller publications on this Italo-Catalan relationship. The first one, curiously, was focused on the Beneventan stuff, all in fragments, published in the 80s by Arturo Peruccio. 1 year after, his own master published his article where some pages are mentioning Italian testimony witnesses, manuscripts and fragments, and a publication of 2003 by Michel Zimmermann, also on 5 pages, which at the end is a thesis already defended in the early 90s and more or less represents the state of the art of the 980s. That means it's again already now 45 years old, is the only comprehensive chapter on this issue I want to outline here. Only in the last time we came back to this issue, let's say, perhaps because we are rediscussing what is Carolingian reform, or what is Carolingian reforms, and I privileged a so-called periphery, that means this Septimanian Catalan world, because it's in more or less focused on the Central European perspectives from Carolingian culture, in their view, a perspective on periphery, but I would guess it is a wrong perspective. The very moment when you live in the southwest of Europe, you see Carolingian studies from, well, the opposite side. And that changes completely your vision. My own vision, educated at German universities with the German tradition of Bernhard Bischof and so on. This is the result of what I cannot present today, but these are the notes in the network. I can show in Italian witnesses, manuscripts and fragments in Catalan collections. Only in Catalan collections. I did not go through foreign collections. That means something like London, Paris, Berlin, and so certainly Vatican Library. There's much more. So only what I found via reading and consulting in situ in the collections. And this is somehow the who is who of what we know about the, let's say, high places of Carolingian, post-Carolingian culture. I come back to this map at the end. I start with the notion, introduction of key authors, works, and manuscript types missing in your own collections. So we have wonderful cases of lost manuscripts from Ripoll, found obviously in the context of Naples. For example, a copy of Eusebius' excerpt compilation of Augustine's works, already copied in the middle of the 10th century. It is witnessed, but we have lost it. We have, for example, also an early copy of the Vita, the life of Saint Nicholas, made in the time of the already mentioned Oliver of Ripoll and Wick, and this exquisite text. So we come across here Greco-Latin translation literature with the schools of Rome and Naples, in this case here of Rome, with Anastasius Bibliothecarius. This manuscript happily is preserved. It's a very famous one because it's also a collection full of Carolingian law, king's laws, and so capitularia, and so on and so on. It's absolutely unique collection. But at the beginning, it has a rewritten version of the translation of St. Stephen, rewritten by a monastic scholar at Ripoll Abbey. Rome is also the center, let's say, the source ground where the abbots and bishops going to the papal court from the middle of the 10th century onwards came across sources they obviously, or texts they obviously did not have. One has to say John the Deacon's Life of St. Gregory the Great is a key text for Carolingian culture because it gives us, let's say, authoritative understanding of what a pope has to be. And the Catalans were so focused after more and more grumbling Western Frankish Caroline dominion that they had to reorientate towards the Pope of the Bishop of Rome. and they were really happy to have a copy of this wonderful text. It is the first Iberian copy of this text. Obviously, we have no study on that. If it could be perhaps the model for the transmission of the life of Gregory the Great, it has to be analyzed in the future. But they introduced also things they did not have, new editions, new Italian editions of classical works like the Morale and Job of Gregory the Great. From the late 9th century onwards, and especially then the later 10th century in the Ottonian Empire, they reinvented to publish Gregory the Great's central work on Morale and Job in form of a Bible bantact. That means in one volume, tremendous size, and this copy from Vic of the time of Oliver, so first quarter of the 11th century, is in international research so far unknown. It's a hidden secret, as so often in Catalan collections. It has really a tremendous size. It's completely preserved and it needs to be studied. So they came across Italian models of this large size new form of edition of the work, and made a copy. This is an investment, no, to make this copy. But other things were also missing. A Carolingian exegesis. And I can say now, after 10 years looking for Carolingian stuff in Septimania and Catalonia, these are unique manuscripts. We have so far no other witness, copy, trace, fragment or so. That means they introduce works they do not have in their collections, and they bring it not from France, but from Italy. This is very interesting. Here, Jaime of Auxerre's commentary on Apocalypse. Patrick had it in his hand some years ago at Tarragona excursion. And by the way, not completed. It's only prepared. It's also very interesting. So they had not the time to make the Italian initial letter ready, but it is prepared and never illuminated. So, or later, then also from the school of Auxerre, Remigius of Auxerre, the commentary in Matthew. According to Michael Gorman, this manuscript is from the Monte Amiata monastery, San Salvador sul Monte Amiata. The other Haimo copy is according to the opinion of Bishop from Faber Abbey. But they reintroduce also missing old authors. A very interesting case is Justus of Urgel's explanation commentary on the Cantica Canigorum, which we would await in a copy, a post-Carolingian copy perhaps in a Catalan monastery or cathedral, but obviously they needed a copy from Italy, again from Fava, to reintroduce this work. It's interesting to see because our colleague in Milano, Eugenia Guglielmietti, who studied and published the critical edition of that work, did not know all the fragments. There are more fragments than this one. Could establish the Stemma Codicum, and then we have another copy, but it's already a Catalan one, and this from Urgel or Roda di Savena. That means they restart disseminating the work from the Italian model. That means they have not at their disposal older Catalan copy. This is very interesting to see. So reintroducing, but there are also very specific texts. So this is my special case, because now we are going to Rome. This is a personal manual of Abbot Oliver, and this produced some polemics in the last years, because I wrote some years ago an article on the Sibylla di Podina, introduced obviously via this manuscript and the Catalan copies, and then going to Leon and so on, and to Navarra, and disseminating this text. You can show it absolutely on philological grounds with a stemma. But we have to look again at the context, and I now understood much more that it's really a Roman. only 1 year after my early medieval Europe article, Georges Leclerc published another article in response and confirming, and he showed that the texts before the Diplomatie Civile, which was an absolutely new text from the Greco-Latin milieu in Rome, they copied two further very interesting texts. The first one on the left hand, and going up to the page, following page, this is the double page, open book, is the second witness of the Chronicon Palatinum, or Laterculus Malalianus. This is an absolute sensation. This work is a work by Theodore of Thapsus, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we know the monastery where he lived, and obviously wrote this short chronicle, exegetical chronicle. And this is the Greco-Latin monastery in Rome. That means we have now the clue where perhaps the Tiberine Sibyl was produced, because this text opens and creates the bridge to the motive of the Tiberine Sibyl. And between is a Cluniac text. This is the Statunum de Defunctis of Odilo of Cluny, but this Roman monastery is the only Cluniac one in Rome. We have to know that, so we have it. Now the question will restart. There is a colleague here from Bristol, your colleague in Bristol, Anke Holtenried. Yes, we have to tell her that. This is perhaps the monastery. That means this manuscript shows us where the translation, the tradition comes from. So this is an absolutely new finding. I want to publish an article on that, because that now explains us from the contextuality of the transmission where these texts come from. So now we see for the first time where the Catalans, or Oliva, really stayed as a Benedictine abbot. Where? They go to Montamiato, they go to Farva, they go to the Roman monastery. If you stay as a Benedictine abbot in Rome, you go to your brothers, not to another denomination, so clerical one. Okay, he was also a bishop, but he was a monk and a bishop, so he was a Benedictine monk. So we have really go to the manuscripts to understand that. Or for you as musiculturalist, interesting, the introduction, also the first witness of 100% a text, but it's already a rewritten text on this chapter, and rewritten in a didactic form, in form of question and answers. So they come across these texts. I would guess they were somewhere in Arezzo, because it's a very early copy, before the middle of the 11th century. So it's quite near to the composition of the work. They see something new, and then they make excerpts in the hurry of the time they have, so that they can really go and make a copy. We have to interpret it always from the context. Gregorian reform is weak. Not only Cluny is weak, also Gregorian reform is weak, and they select things they really need. They do not follow up 100% Gregorian reform. The whole zone, I can tell you now, after 10 years Carolingian studies, is very conservative. With the argument, we are 100% Carolingian. We do not need, and they are Rome-orientated since the 9th, 10th century. They do not need to argue to be reformed from Rome with the Italian reformers. So they decline many things. But they introduce texts. This one was found, this fragment found by Bernhard Bischof in Freiburg im Breisgau. It's metrical life of the Gregorian reformer Anselm, Bishop of Lucca. And it's so specific because the other tradition was, a copy was in the Ripoll manuscript, burned in the 19th century. And this is also a Catalan copy, so that we have only this text in Catalan witnesses. This is absolutely unique. That means you see they go to Lucca in Tuscany and came across the text and had the copies. This text had no dissemination so far, we can say, in Italy. And other things, I come to a very last point before the vision, the networks. how can we discover new notes in this still unknown network of knowledge? So we have here a very famous case, Florus of Lyons' dedication letter to his Psalter editions, dedicated to Abt Hildratus of Novalesa. This is a unique transmission. We have to discuss in with context this happened. We have a relatively exact dating of the manuscript of the Ripoll Bible, so that we have now to reflect about the edition of the Psalter, if there is perhaps more hidden behind all that it is not only the dedication letter, but it is also the Psalter version, but it is not done so far. It's very curious that we have key manuscripts of the 11th century, because as perhaps you know, the Catalan Bible editions were the very first richly illuminated Bibles in this pre-Gregorian Reform period, but there are still many secrets hidden in the manuscripts. But there are also other phenomena. For example, they put the capitula of capitulationes from Italian Bibles into their own Bible editions, late Carolingian Bible of Rogel. It is added in the margins. In a new edition of the San Pere de Rodas Bible from Ripoll, it is already integrated. That means they have templates, material, so that we have to go to the little tiny small text to discover connections with Italian text tradition. And a final case here, a twin of transmitted Carolingian letters, one of Remigius of Auxerre, the other from Lupus of Ferrières. I come back to Novalesa, because only the Ripoll copy and a Novalesa manuscript, which is in Chicago, has both texts together. All the other transmission, especially of the Remigius letter, always only the Remigius letter is transmitted, but here we have two manuscripts, and I made some years ago a collation and philological analysis, and I can say the one must have been the model of the other. That means the older Novalesa manuscript was the model of the other. Perhaps of an older Ripoll copy, we do not know, but we have here also a very, very narrow relationship. So I come back to this map. What is the vision for the future? The problem is, as you already saw, there are Italian manuscripts, products, not old ones introduced then centuries later, but perhaps really contemporary items and brought to Catalonia. Then we have very, very selected texts already written by Catalan copyists brought to with their own miscellaneous manuscripts, but the tricky thing is that we have also non-Italian works and not Italian authors, which were also copied from Italian models. And this is the future. So all the other points you have here, Monte Gargano, Lucca, Arezzo, Lodi, Parma, there you have all these types of manuscripts, choirs, hagiographical material, very individual things, and they bring it to Catalonia and they make it with their own copies. Patrick, this is exactly what we have in this famous letter of Pontius, searching for the text between Pavia and Ripoll and these things. This is a wonderful witness we have, but this happened obviously much often. They were really systematic looking for. And I would say the vision for the future is that we have to understand why they go to this or that place. For example, Verona and Frutuaria are the two places where Vic and Ripoll sacramentaries took formula from there. Very individual formula which are not only transmitted in this region or only in one manuscript. And we have to understand in the future the reason for going and knowing about exactly going to these places. I think it's personal networks. These are relationships between the abbots and the bishops. And they told him, you want to make a new edition? hey, let's look at here the formulas we use here. Do you like to introduce? This is the liberty of the pre-Reformed church, that you can put your text, tiny little texts, into your new editions. Bibles, sacramentaries, homiliaries, and so on and so on. The rest, when you are interested in, what does mean Monte Cassino? I will tell you in a private talk. There's also Catalan stuff in Italy, not only Italian stuff in Catalonia, but also Catalan products in Monte Cassino and so on. But this is the future. This is the future after the future. So I'm at the end, though. Thank you.
I really hope that's indeed going to be true. No, thank you. I mean, obviously, it's extremely exciting for me and for us. Not so much to think about the fact that people traveled and texts traveled, because we kind of, everybody knows it, right? But I think what makes a difference is seeing exactly those places where, for which we have evidence of contact, and seeing the texts exactly that are circulated, in what form, and by being circulated by whom. So I think that's the most interesting thing about your. And there's a lot that I would like to discuss with you. So we should probably have a private meeting after all, during which you will tell us about Monte Cassino and everything. But let me just say that, I think circulation in this sense is important for us, because we see, as I said, evidence for it. There was something else I wanted to add. I think my mind went blank for a second. Perhaps I shall let someone else chair.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I'm afraid the acoustics here are great, so we didn't hear much of your talk here.
Yeah, so more or less, yeah. Yeah.
Yes, but I wanted to ask about Italian exemplars, or I didn't understand what were you saying there. These manuscripts you showed.
What I showed. Well, when you have a little bit expertise in Italian paleography, you saw Italian style, so Romanesque Faber style. I do not know if I have to agree with Margaret Groman's qualification of Montamiato, but he wrote an article in Scriptorium in 2002, but it is at least from this zone. It's not the Romanesque style, for example. And other Italian things I have, there's more stuff, so it's typical, so 12th century, and you see immediately Bologna products, and so this is quite clear. This is professional production. And then the tricky thing, as I said at the end, is that we have Catalan copies of individual text translation where, with philological arguments, you can argue at least a very neat relationship. I have more cases of that where scholars showed that they belong to the same subfamily, but they did not question historical context for that. Why? Why do they pop up? They always say, oh, why do they pop up in Catalan monasteries? Because they did not understand the interrelationship. You understand? So the problem is that we have to discover more and more of individual, perhaps already in studies, individual qualified text situations, and to find the counterpart. Or that I come across something very strange in our collections, and I see, perhaps also from it copied initial letters from the model, that I understand it was an Italian model behind such things. So we have really go to the details to understand that.
Micrologus. It is very interesting because it's very interesting because it dates very early. So interesting that they decided to copy these treatise, and they didn't copy it using the notation of the treatise, but another notation. And I think it's very interesting that they decided to use the Equitarian notation and not another notation, because maybe the Equitarian notation is the notation that fits better to for the scope, to copying a treatise like Micrologus, because using Equitarian notation you can understand the diastematy or relative diastematy without using the notation used by Guido.
Oh no, that is the famous music manuscript from Ripoll, no, Ripoll 42, from Oliba of Ripoll, the monk Oliba of Ripoll, who wrote musical treatises. And I think what still has to be discussed, did not read all the excellent research on this manuscript, because it has the text of the Hucbald and Pseudo-Hucbald school as well, the Carolingian stuff before, and Boetius, it's opening with Boetius de Musica. But let's say the constellation, how they put these things together, tells us the story how this manuscript grew, how it developed. And at the end, I really have to look if someone already discussed, let's say, the extract, why exactly this extract in the context of Oliba of Ripoll's music activities. Did they perhaps try to renovate, modernize? And as you know, many activities do end up with something in the limbo because you cannot break with the tradition, but at least they were curious and looking at new theories. And so I'm not an expert, but I will read secondary literature to understand more, let's say, the contextuality of this rewritten extract. This is the question, the message, I would say so.
If there are further questions to Matthias, I kindly ask you for patience until the coffee break, because we have one further speaker for this session and we are kind of behind our schedule. So, but since our group is together for quite a long time, and still there will be plenty of opportunities to keep asking Matthias questions.
Exactly. Thank you.
Our next speaker is personified interdisciplinarity. Francesco holds a master's degree in jazz piano, and he holds a master's degree in biotechnology. He also worked for the Institute of Sociology and the Aesthetics of Music at the Universidad Nova in Lisbon, and he is now part of the SCRIBEMUS project and PhD candidate under supervision of Giovanni Varelli and Italo-Catalan. And the floor is yours, Francesco.
Thank you. This is the PDF, right? Okay. So this presentation is based on the first phase of my doctoral research, which I began in April 2025. Thank you. And since then, I've been visiting all the archives that preserve Catalan musical sources containing musical notation, whether Catalan or Aquitanian, dating mainly from the 9th to the 11th century. I have identified and I am still identifying a considerable number of new sources, all of them fragments. And this adds to the corpus of sources already known and catalogued by earlier scholars, above all Joaquim Garrigosa, whose extensive and fundamental work made this research possible in the first place. And for all these sources, I am producing a complete index of the chants they contain, following the standards of Cantus Index. At the same time, I'm analyzing and comparing their contents, not only at the textual level, but also from notational and melodic perspectives, with the aim of defining as clearly as possible the liturgical musical repertory of the Catalan area, and also to clarify the importance of the Catalan area in the spreading of the repertory in the Iberian Peninsula. Among the many archives involved in this research, I decided to begin with Vic, simply because it preserves the largest number of sources relevant to my work. Vic was the capital of the county of Osona, today one of the 41 comarcas of Catalonia. And the archive in Vic, now officially called the Archivo y Biblioteca Episcopal de Vic, ABEV, appears in earlier scholarship under different names, most commonly as the MEV or others. This variation is sometimes called confusion in the literature, and the history behind these changes is actually quite fascinating, but yeah, we can discuss it in another place. Today, with maps. Today the archive functions as a single unified institution, bringing together all kinds of documentation, ecclesiastical and non-ecclesiasticals alike, including material originating from parishes, municipalities across the comarca. And for this reason, it is sometimes difficult to determine the original provenance of certain documents or to establish when and from where they arrived in Vic. So, to understand the liturgical and musical significance of the Catalan area, and especially that of Vic and Osona, a brief historical and geographical overview is necessary. So, from the early 8th century, the region was under Saracen control following the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and Frankish reconquest formally began in 778 with a failed siege of Zaragoza. And Charlemagne succeeded in establishing the first stable Frankish foothold in what is now Catalonia, the so-called Spanish March, at Girona in 785, with the city being handed over to the Franks with the support of the local Gothic population. From 776 to beyond 800, the Carolingian rulers were engaged in intermittent warfare in order to expel Muslim forces and consolidate control over the Christian population of the Spanish March. Around 790, Urgell and Cerdanya were incorporated into the new kingdom of Aquitaine, and in 798, Louis, son of Charlemagne and king of Aquitaine, ordered the reinforcement of frontier defenses, including at Vic. Just finally, in the 810, after more than 40 years of conflict, a treaty fixed the southern limits of Frankish rule, just beyond Barcelona, effectively ending attempts to establish the frontier at the river Ebro, at the border there. And one key point I would like to stress is that we have no proof that the annexation of these territories, the Frankish kingdom, immediately entailed the introduction of the Roman Frankish rite to replace the so-called Old Hispanic rite that had previously been used throughout the Iberian Peninsula. It is worth remembering that the main Catalan cities were handed over to the Franks under agreements that allowed the Gothic inhabitants to retain their own laws, and this tells us nothing directly about the liturgical practice. Urgell, one of the earliest annexed areas, saw its episcopal see destroyed during the Arab raid in 792 and rebuilt only in 839. It is therefore likely that the Frankish religious intervention was more rapid and more direct there. We know this particularly because of the adoptionist controversy and the exile of the Bishop Felix of Urgell, which involved Charlemagne and Alcuin personally in the final decades of the 9th century. And for other counties, much less is known and much still needs to be reconstructed, something I hope to address by the end of my research. Another map. So the area of Vic and Osona deserves special attention because it represents a rather unusual case. Already in 826, 827, an anti-Frankish revolt known as the Rebellion of Aissou succeeded in breaking away from the Frankish control. The region then remained effectively uncontrolled until 878, when it was reconquered by the Count Guifré I, who ruled over Urgell, Cerdanya, Barcelona, and Girona, at the time when the Spanish March itself was already disappearing. Two important points follow from this. First, we simply do not know what happened from a liturgical point of view in the area of Vic before 878. A small number of documentary references from the 10th and 11th centuries clarify a couple of things. On the one hand, the area was not completely uninhabited, despite what is sometimes stated in historiography. On the other hand, after the revolt of Aiso, there seem to have been no Christians, or at least not enough to form a remembered or stable community. With the Count Guifrey I from 878 onwards, there was an attempt to return to a previous or primitive state of affairs, meaning the situation before the revolt. This involved not only cultural but also physical restoration, including the reuse of buildings that had fallen into disuse. That earlier state was probably Visigothic rather than Roman Frankish in character, although this remains an hypothesis. In any case, it is difficult to imagine that a territory outside Frankish control would already have adopted the Roman rite. Second point, Guifrey's territorial authority extended across several dioceses. In particular, the Urgell maintained stronger connection with Toulouse, while the coastal dioceses were more closely linked to Narbonne, which was also an archiepiscopal see. What we do know with certainty is that in 880, the Cathedral of Vic was consecrated and an episcopal see was established, with a bishop probably coming from Narbonne. From that moment on, 880, the liturgy must have been Roman. This leads to a key question. Was there liturgical unity and also unity of musical repertory across the Catalan area, even through political boundaries did not coincide with the diocesan ones? It should also be remembered that bishops were chosen directly by the Catalan counts and merely consecrated in Narbonne. Narbonne had no real control over episcopal appointments. Bishops were often members of noble families, and power was frequently transmitted from father to son, creating figures who combined political and religious authority and whose influence crossed both county and diocesan boundaries. One final historical point, just to avoid this paper into a history lecture, concerns the 10th century. From 951 onwards, the bishop and Count Guisard of Urgell began actively purchasing land from private owners within the Diocese of Vic over a large area to the southwest of the city. Churches were already present there or were built shortly afterwards. A couple of examples like Sant Martí de Sant Foras or Santa Maria de Lestani, which later became famous, but it is first mentioned in 990. With all this in mind, finally, we can now turn to the sources preserved at the archive to investigate the possible existence of liturgical differences, but also differences in notational styles within the Catalan or South Frankish musical script. So, water. The archive of Vic preserves 64 sources with Catalan notation, including both fragments and complete codices. This number rises to 167 if we also include sources with Aquitanian notation. Musical sources later than 12th century are not included in this count. In addition, there are sources produced in the area of Vic or Zona that are no longer preserved in the archive. And for example, the well-known act of consecration of the Church of Tona, just close to Vic, preserved today in the Biblioteca de Catalunya in Barcelona, datable to 888 or 89, and containing an antiphon with Catalan musical notation. Today, I will focus exclusively on the notational analysis of the sources, particularly those with Catalan notation. After compiling the indices for all the fragments, I constructed a pneumatic tables for each source and identified a series of parameters and categories for defining the pneumatic forms or graphs present, which you can see on the slide, particularly the mid column. In some cases, it is very difficult to determine whether a particular graphic form is truly present in a fragmentary source, simply because too little material survives. In such cases, I adopted pragmatic criteria based on the overall number of neumes preserved as well as on earlier pneumatic studies that correlate certain forms with the dating of a source, for example. In other instances, I mark some parameters as NA, not applicable. This is just a part of a very huge and massive table I have. Too much. By comparing old sources, several patterns emerge, sometimes confirming, sometimes contradicting earlier scholarship. Today we'll focus on the results I just consider most significant. So old sources from Vic share the same notational style, with the exception of 3 sources that show a particular form of pes, which I will discuss shortly, and 2 sources that display what might be described as an archaic notational style when compared to their dating and to the textual script. The 2 sources with this archaic-looking style are fragments 522 and 72. The set of neumes they use is typically associated with the mid-10th century, particularly because of features such as the theta-shaped torculus and the joined forms of the climacus, among others. And however, the textual script of these fragments appear to belong to the late 11th or even early 12th century. 2 counterexamples help illustrate what might be considered a more contemporary alignment between musical and textual script, fragments 7.1 and 1631, which use the same pneumatic set but have a more archaic ancient text script. I do not mean to suggest the existence of an archaizing, is it the word? Thank you. Grade in musical paleography as such a concept only really applies to textual script. Rather, this probably reflects scribes who continued to use a familiar set of neumes over time, in other words, a possibly older scribes. In any case, the presence of looped neumes and joined forms with more than 4 notes within a single graphic sign can still be attested at the end of the 11th and even the beginning of the 12th century, which is new. My favorite part, and the last part, the V-pes, or V-shaped pes. The 3 sources that show the particular form of pes, known as the V-shaped pes, already studied, for example, by Barrio Nuevo, are fragments manuscript 122/1, 1631, and 5/1. In a previous study, I already argued that the use of the V-pes is characteristic of the Urgell, or Andorra, nowadays Andorra, area, where it is used systematically, always, to indicate a semitone. So far, I have observed this for mi fa, si do, A, B flat, and possibly even D, E flat. All sources that use this form with this melodic meaning can be shown to originate from the Urgell area. And we also have whole manuscripts for this. Just a few examples here, because I have plenty, I just put a couple of them. One source that I have recently discovered and cataloged in Andorra, written in Aquitanian notation, also is the V-pes, in exactly the same place, within the same chant as Urgell sources do. And it is not in this one, but this one, the bottom right. It's Aquitanian notation. This is a new fragment. For example, we have an example with the Communion Ecce Virgo, and that shows manuscript 1805 is a gradual from Andorra, and they share the same exact melodic reading with the Andorran one, which is different, slightly different with Narbonne and Urieux. Yes, sorry. We are talking about this shape and this shape, indicating always a semitone. Of course, we have here a relation. Here we have just one relationship in the 2 pedes, not one, a possible melodic variation. Of course, this is the Ecce Virgo, and we have other melodic variation, like here. Ecce Virgo concipie, Ecce Virgo concipie. It's the same. Here it's even different. It's different, but well. The point is that the VPS used, this is the only source, extant source, I'm sorry, with the VPS in Aquitanian notation. But we don't have time to sing more. So, I'm sorry. Yeah, although it is not easy to explain why sources using this graphic form ended up in Vic, I would like to present evidence suggesting that these sources were not in fact produced there. Fragments 122 and 1631 contain chants in which the VPS appears exactly in the same melodic positions as in Urgell sources, like here on the left. And moreover, when comparing shared repertory across the Vic corpus, fragment 122 shows melodic readings that differ from those of fragment, for example, 522 in this example, as well as different graphic choices for the same melodic shapes, even when both sources possess the same pneumatic inventory. Here, for example, in Benedict, we have a B lineola, if we can say so, and we have different shape, even though in manuscript 522, the bottom one, we also have the lineola, and many other cases like this. In addition, paleographical analysis of the textual script of fragment 122, as anticipated to me in a private conversation with Professor Tischler, suggests that it was not produced in Vic, indeed. These data do not prove an Urgell origin, but they do suggest that the fragment was probably not produced in Vic or Ozona area. This is significant because it allows us to identify at least two distinct notational styles within the Catalan area, possibly linked to melodic differences as well. It also helps define the notational profile of Vic by contrast through the absence of certain graphic forms. Fragment 5/1 presents yet another case. We might not have time for this. So, I will just skip to the conclusions, which are not here. Oh well, the 5/1 is not here, so perfect. I just skip to the conclusion. I don't know why, but to summarize, no substantial differences in notation or repertory emerge within the sources produced in the Vic-Ozona area. The only sources that differ show a distinct pneumatic inventory, and there is evidence suggesting that they may not have been produced in Vic, including their close similarities with Urgell sources and divergent melodic readings when compared with securely Vic-produced material. Some pneumatic forms previously thought to have disappeared by 11th century are in fact still present in fragments datable to 11th and even in 12th century. I would avoid the term archaizing, very hard to say, in this context, as it would imply a graded development in musical script that is more appropriate to textual paleography. Of course, this analysis needs to be expanded to include all other relevant sources from other archives in order to identify possible differences in notational styles and music repertories more securely. And that's it.
The V-shaped pass. And how many different scribal hands write this V-shaped thing? And have you noticed opportunities to write it somewhere where it's not used and a regular pass is used instead?
Okay, for the first question, I don't quite understand the second one. Can you? No, la prima sì. The second question, sorry.
The second question, if okay, I'm a scribe that knows how to use this and knows where to use this. What are the places where you feel like it could be used and it's not used? Are there many, or how, compared to how many opportunities you have to use it, how often was it actually used?
Okay, so for the first question, I would say that we can just count the number of sources. It is, A complete paleographical survey has not been yet made. And of course, we are finding new sources, but the sources with the V-shaped bess. For example, in one of them has been said that one of the hand of Montserrat 72 manuscript, which is a Liber Mysticus, quite a genre. One of the hands is the same hand of the gradual I showed before, number 1805. In my opinion, that's not true, but I don't know. So we don't know how many hands. And for the second question, it is hard. For example, if you look at the left here, in the bottom source, we have two shapes, two pedes, the same V-shaped pedes. And in the top one, so we have a pes here, a disgregated one, and two pedes with a V-shape. We have one pes, one other square pes, and one V-shape. So we don't really know if it's just a different melody. Could be instead of, could be looking at here, could be do, re, mi, mi, fa, for example. And here we have at least 1/3. I guess that is re, fa, mi, fa, mi, fa. Could be just a difference in the melody, or I think they are quite consistent. I mean, at least in the Urgella area, they are quite consistent. So I don't know if it answered.
Thank you. I remark in some manuscripts, I look at Hill Museum in States of a microfilm from manuscript from Vic. Sometimes you find special, for example, Torculus, a large interval, a third. And when you compare with the repertory in other manuscripts, in everywhere, it corresponds to a feeling of impulse. For example, and it's written Torculus special, and it's very you think it's of a form, on being. Did you find this possibility? It was in the office.
Yes, I mean, I found different features on some particular graphs, some particular neumes. For example, in the Torculus, we mainly have two types of Torculus: the theta one, and I don't like the word the regular one. Okay, I don't like this word, but. So they clearly have different purposes, in my opinion. Could be rhythmical. Talking about melody, I'm not quite sure about the track, the shape of the Torculus, if it's a different interval, but for sure, the serif added at the right end of the Torculus indicates an interval larger than a second. So if we have a Torculus like this one, maybe see a little serif here, indicates at least in this manuscript, not in other manuscripts. I guess also in other manuscripts, they are very consistent. An interval between the second and the third larger of an interval larger than a second, at least a third, could be a fourth or second time. So, yes, but the cases are multiple, and I need to, keep. Thank you.
Where's Scott?
Indeed, I was looking for copies.
First, thanks to our three contributors again. Thank you.
Solo da Vic era difficile tirare fuori qualcosa, però.
So I'm done here. Bye.
we're absolutely, truly, utterly delighted to have Susan Rankin delivering the keynote paper for our conference. We are delighted because we know Susan Rankin is really not necessary to give any presentation more than saying, of course, that she's a Professor Emeritus of Medieval Music at the University of Cambridge, she's Fellow of the British Academy, and she is, most importantly, the reason why we're all here today. Without her and her influencing many generations of scholars, such as myself, such a gathering wouldn't have taken place. It's thanks to her ideas and her approach to the study of early notations that I was able, I could say, to grow as a scholar and build on the basic foundations that this school, I was actually a student here, and the basic solid background that I got from this institution was then made much more, broader and much more intense, thanks to continuous exchange and intellectual stimuli from having conversations, and most importantly, the supervision of my PhD thesis 15 years ago, or something like that. So as you've noticed, I'm not reading the text, I'm sort of improvising. I've been told that it's important to say something personal when giving these introductions, and I think I've done it. So I think it's really time for us to hear Susan speaking to us about a very interesting and fascinating topic, which is from Neumes in Campo Aperto to Neumes on lines at Christchurch, Canterbury. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you for the introduction, Giovanni. He's one of the people who knows just how tough I am to the students that I work with. It's a great pleasure to come and talk here, and it's such an indulgence to speak at a notation conference. And I should say before I start that I'm really going to talk about English notation, and I'll get a little bit out of England. I'll get as far as Normandy, but I hope that some of the lessons of what I'm going to say today will be useful in completely different notational situations, and I'm encouraged in that by the fact that the last two papers this afternoon both had issues that come up in what I'm doing, and you'll see that very quickly. Right, let's go on. You see here the first 5 strophes of the rhythmic hymn O Genitrix Aeterni Virgo, written out and notated at Canterbury at the end of the 11th century. When I first saw this, I imagined that I was looking at the earliest example of a precisely pitched notation written in England. O Genitrix has been traced in 11 medieval sources, including 6 which date from the second half of the 11th century. It's copied in several manuscripts among the works of Peter Damian, an Italian Benedictine monk who was much associated with Pope Leo IX. Damian's last appointment was as Bishop of Ostia, that was in 1057, and he died in 1072 or 1073. This likely, I know it's contested, but this likely authorship would account for the fact that 9 of the 11 sources are Italian, including all of the 11th century sources, that is, except for this one English example. But it too might be due to an immediate Italian connection, for the Benedictine monk Lanfranc was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070. Lanfranc was born in Pavia. I'm glad to say, in the early 11th century. By the late 1030s, he was in Normandy, at Avranches and then Le Bec. In 1066, he was appointed the first abbot of Saint-Étienne at Caen, a monastery founded by Duke William. In a study published in 2023, Patrizia Lendinara suggests that the presence of Ogenitrix in this Canterbury manuscript might be directly linked to Lanfranc's knowledge of the hymn, but she thought it more likely that he came across the hymn while in Normandy than that he had known it in Italy. In terms of chronology, that makes sense. The main content of the book in which Ogenitrix was copied at Canterbury is an expositio hymnorum, a collection of prose paraphrases of 95 hymns, with interlinear glosses in Old English. Just to explain this content, I've chosen a hymn familiar to musicologists, Ut queant laxis resonare fibris. Sung in honor of St. John Baptist, this was composed in Sapphic verses. In the paraphrase, the meter has been set aside, the words now ordered in such a way as to clarify their syntax. Thus the verb solve sits with its object reatum, nouns sit beside the relevant adjectives, polluti with labii, gestorum with tuorum, and the saint to whom the hymn is addressed appears at the very beginning. The only word included in the paraphrase which was not present in the original hymn is the opening vocative O. So the book is not a glossed hymnal with explanations of the theological meaning of the texts, but one in which Latin hymn texts were straightened out, with translations of individual words into Old English set alongside. The collection was probably intended for the schoolroom. With this book, students could be introduced to the hymns they would sing in the daily cycle of the Divine Office. The hypothesis that the book was intended as a teaching tool to support the performance of the Divine Office is sustained by the other main element in the book, a collection of 27 monastic canticles. This slide shows the beginning of the series, Domine miserere nostri te enim expectavimus, drawn from Isaiah chapter 33. The texts of the canticles were not altered as the hymns had been, but they were provided with interlinear glosses which translate individual words into Old English. The canticle Gaude et laetare Zion from Zechariah chapter 2 closes the canticle collection and is followed on the opposite recto by Ogenitrix Aeterne Virgo and another poem Ad Mensam Philosophiae, which finishes on the verso. These two notated rhythmi are on the last folio of a quaternion, which had been left blank at the end of the series of canticles, and there's no difficulty in associating the entry with Canterbury. So in this manuscript, Cotton Julius A6, we have a book which had been made before the Norman conquest of 1066 and reflected the practice of the Anglo-Saxon Church. But these two notated rhythmi were written at the end of the book some decades after the conquest. And it's with the notation for the first of these, the hymn Ogenitrix Aeterne Virgo, that I shall begin this examination of notational practice at Christ Church in the period between 1066 and 1100. I want first to look at the way space is allocated to text and to music notation. In this entry, a good deal of room has been allocated to the music notation, with less than a quarter of the space between lines occupied by the text. As these poems were written on the last folio of a gathering, as these poems were written on the last folio of a gathering, they could be entered using the 16 lines already ruled. And the lines of writing on folio 90 recto on the right do correspond precisely to those on folio 89 verso on the left. But the module for the Latin canticle text on the left is much larger than that of the text for the poems on the right. That this difference of text size was not made in order to fit the two poems onto one folio can be verified in two ways. First, that Ad Mensam Philosophiae required only 9 of the 16 lines on the verso leaving a good deal of blank space. And second, more crucial to my argument today, that the apportioning of space to text and to music was manipulated so as to allow a much greater space for the music notation than had been usual previously. That can be demonstrated through comparison with two other Canterbury notations. At the top of this slide is an image from a manuscript made at the other Benedictine centre in Canterbury, St. Augustine's. This passage was written and notated by a scribe who can be found working in a series of St. Augustine's manuscripts. Some of his work can be securely dated to the 1090s, which means that this entry may not have been made much before that of Ogenitrix, and might even be contemporary. But the main point is that this scribe continued to write musical notation in the same way as had been current before the Norman conquest. And on the bottom half of the slide is a passage of notation in another book from St. Augustine's. Here the text has been written at St. Augustine's, but not by an English scribe. The text hand is identifiable as that of a scribe trained at Mont Saint-Michel. And this was probably a monk who had accompanied Scholandus, a monk of Mont Saint-Michel, who was appointed abbot of St. Augustine's in 1072. The music notation in this entry is also consistent with other examples from Mont Saint-Michel. So on this slide, you have an example of a typically English notation written by an English scribe, and an example of Norman notation written by a scribe from Mont Saint-Michel, both written in the last quarter of the 11th century, and in both cases, the proportion of space allotted to text and to music is almost 50-50, certainly more than 1/3 to 2/3. That decision to allow so much of the available space between ruled lines for the notation of Ogenitrix meant that the neumes could be written lower and higher in the space over the text with a considerably greater degree of differentiation. Allowing for curvature in the image at the top, it was my own photograph and the page wasn't flat. There are really only 3 different levels in the space for music at the top. The same is true of the example written by a Mont Saint-Michel scribe at St. Augustine's. Whereas for Ogenitrix, there seem to be as many as 6 different levels. And it was because of the high number of different heights at which neumes were positioned that I thought I was looking at the earliest example of a precisely pitched notation written in England when I first saw this entry. On this slide, I've run horizontal lines across the image of the first written line of the hymn, each successive line representing a pitch step up or down. So this isn't like modern lines. This isn't lines and spaces. These are individual pitches. Then I simply chose the first mode and the starting tone C as a hypothetical framework, and from that made the transcription you can see here. It was not difficult, since the neumes are indeed positioned rather clearly. And you can see that there are not many neumes which do not sit comfortably on the lines I have drawn. Now, the poem is strophic, and its musical setting repeats the same melodic outline for each strophe. It ought therefore to be possible to check this transcription, since the melody is written out 11 times. But look what happens. Almost nothing matches from one strophe to the next. Whichever set of notes marked with one colour you look at, no 2, let alone 3 transcriptions match. How wrong I was in thinking I was looking at a diastematic notation. There is notation for Ogenitrix in 2 other sources. For the first, I don't have a picture. It's a breviary from the Abbey of Farfa, Vatican Kg C6177, which is dated to the 3rd quarter of the 11th century. And here Ogenitrix appears in a gathering added later in the 11th century. I wasn't able to find an image, but Susan Boynton had described the notation for Ogenitrix as imprecise diastematic notation. I have no idea how imprecise and diastematic relate to each other in this, but whatever, it's not diastematic. The other source, which you see here, Vatlat 3797, is a collection of the works of Peter Damian, which belonged to the Abbey of Sancta Maria at Faenza at the end of the 11th century. Here the hymn appears twice, first in the full version with 26 strophes, I've shown you a bit of that, and then at the head of a series of notations, each for the first strophe of one of the hymns. The notation here is written out on dry point lines, and that is certainly diastematic. There are no clefs, but the relation of neumes and lines suggests that my idea of pitching the melody with D final was incorrect. So I altered the pitches of the transcription to have G final, and here you see the transcriptions from the Canterbury and Faenza sources juxtaposed to each other. Since this is certainly the same melody, the relative imprecision of the Canterbury notation is exposed. Even if variation is allowed for, the whole thing is not really right. For example, I in the lower part of the page, I just highlighted in red the treatment of C as a tonal center in the Faenza notation, and the equivalent on the much less likely pitch of B in my transcription from the Canterbury notation. I think that's in its own terms a way of seeing that the Canterbury notation isn't exact. Given its evident imprecision, you might wonder why I've dedicated quite so much of our attention this afternoon to this example. The reason is simple. This notation sits at a turning point between older and newer techniques for writing musical notation. It uses many different heighted positions for neumes, so that the movement between one and the next is exposed, not only as moving upwards or downwards, but as a step between adjacent pitches or through a larger interval. Nevertheless, this notation is not diastematically precise and should still come under the heading in campo aperto. Recall of the exact melodic intervals remains central in transmission of the melody, with written notation as a support of that recall. Within 10 years of the writing of this notation, and perhaps even less, scribes working at Christchurch were using stave lines and clefs, as you can see in this notation for the sequence Hodierna Resonant Gaudia in honor of St. Dunstan, who had been Archbishop of Canterbury. These neumes are written on dry point lines with two sets of clefs, D and B natural for the lower tessitura, which is what you can see on the left-hand side. And then you'll see on the right-hand side another set, which is B natural and E for the higher tessitura. This is probably the earliest Christchurch example of notation written on staves, and it's dated circa 1100. A series of other Christchurch examples datable to the first quarter of the 12th century affirms the established use of this new practice from 1100 on. Here and in other examples written at Christchurch in the first quarter of the 12th century, we already see the use of plummet to rule the stave lines. So in the early example, which is the sequence on the left, the lines are ruled in dry point with plummet used to mark the text line, whereas in the example to the right, all of the lines are ruled in plummet. In many centres in England and in other parts of Europe, the changeover from writing neumes in campo aperto to neumes on stave lines could take place overnight. Of course, it was necessary for scribes to understand enough music theory to be able to choose clefs, and enough modal theory to know where on a stave individual neumes representing a melody in a specific mode should be placed. But this was relatively elementary theory, and it had been around for a long time, at least since the millennium. Leaving aside for now possible sources for the concrete idea of writing on lines, once a musically competent scribe had seen stave lines, their use could be quickly taken up. Even the ruling of a page was handled with ease. In many early examples, ruling for text provides the framework, with further lines ruled in between, as here in a book in which the Christchurch monk Eadmer supervised the collecting of his own writings. Indeed, quite a lot of this book was written in Eadmer's own hand, and of course one would like to know whether he wrote the music notation or not, but I can't tell that. There's nowhere that I can put the music with the text in such a way to say, oh well, this is the same hand. The melodies for 3 hymns are written on a recto page, that's what you see here, and the verso of that same page, which I've shown over there, you can see the ruling for stave lines as it comes through the parchment. So at the top of the verso, the text scribe simply wrote on every other ruled line. In view of the potential suddenness of a changeover, the interest of Christchurch records of musical notations written between 1066 and 1100 is considerable. In reading through these, it's possible to observe alterations to notational habits made over a long period. Today I want to show you those alterations and to think about how they can be understood and what they indicate about the history of ways of writing musical notation, history of ways of writing, reading, and using musical notation. In this history, I do not claim any especial place for Christchurch, and I'm sure that all of the notational characteristics I have seen in the Christchurch sources can be traced elsewhere as well. What's unusual in this case is the number of extant musical sources written in that last quarter of the century and in the first quarter of the next, and thus the richness of the record. The starting point has to be the arrival of Normans, not just as visitors, but as rulers in power in the land. With their arrival at Christchurch, we see a technique of writing neumes which had been used on the continent, but not previously in England. So on this slide, you can see a musical entry by an excellent Canterbury scribe written in the middle of the 11th century. This is the typical English music script, written in tall, perpendicular strokes. And then, this is what we see in a hymnal, also made at Canterbury in the mid-11th century, but with notations added post-conquest. So, the virga sign, previously written as a simple long stroke, now has a head at the top. A pèse, 2 rising notes, written previously with a short horizontal stroke turning to a longer vertical stroke, now has a note head at the upper point. That incorporation of note heads can be traced back to the late 9th century in examples written at Tours, and at that stage the note heads may have been the simple result of using a pen which allowed the contrast of thick and thin strokes. Whatever the reason for its appearance, by the second half of the 11th century, this contrast of thick and thin and the addition of note heads to the tops of vertical strokes had become a normal constituent of notations written in a variety of Norman centres. So these are examples written at the Benedictine abbeys of Jumièges, Saint-Vandrille, and Saint-Étienne at Caen. An important result of these thickened strokes and note heads is a greater degree of clarity about the relative position of the notes they signify, since they were more emphatic visually than the earlier contrasted pair of a long stroke, the virga, and a point, punctum. Combined with considerable movement of position over the text, as here in the notation for the hymn Chorus Nove Jerusalem, a notation written with thickened strokes and note heads could record and therefore quickly remind a reader rather more about a melody than had been usual in older notations. So here, for the words Nova Meli Dulcedinem, movement through successively higher notes from a low E to a high C is really clear, even if not written diastematically. And then, if you go to the last line, for the first syllable of Gaudiis, the movement downwards through a tone and then a third between F and D, followed by E, F, G, can actually be read diastematically, just that little set of notes. Of course, I had to use later diastematic notations in order to make this transcription, but a reader who knew the melody would have found reading this as easy as making the transcription was for me. From those two techniques, on the one hand note heads and neumes written with thickened strokes, and on the other care in the positioning of neumes, I now move over to something quite different, the introduction of a new sign. Now, the notation for the song Aurea personet lyra is in a manuscript, this notation is in a manuscript which belonged to the Abbey of Fécamp on the northern coast of Normandy. The notation written there was very similar to that of Mont Saint-Michel, and neither Fécamp nor Mont Saint-Michel, which were older establishments, neither of these places used the note heads and thickened strokes typical of other Norman centres. And I wanted to show you, before we go on to my special sign, something that puzzled me for a long time, and then I realized it was very simple. One of the techniques which is typical of Fécamp music scribes is the direct attachment of an ariscus to the virga stroke, rather than writing it as an attached sign, rather than writing virga ariscus. And I've indicated that here with red arrows. But it's not that sign that matters in my discussion of alterations, but another, one which indicates the step of a semitone up or down, and which is usually called a mi neum. We will get to the Francesco's V pays in a second. But let's just start with the mi neum. As for the note heads, this sign was not invented in Normandy. Many of you will know that Solange Corbin wrote about the mi neum in Portuguese notations. Then Marie-Noël Colette wrote about its use in the early 12th century Saint Martial manuscript, BNF Latin 1139. And then David Hiley promised but never produced a study of its use in Norman notations. So here is the mi neum in a Norman notation, written here to show the step of a semitone from F down to E, or from E up to F. In fact, that same sign can be found in English notations. This image shows the first original page of the Winchester troper made in the mid-11th century. The same sign is used in this notation not for the lower note of a semitone step, mi, but for the upper note of that step, fa. Compared to the Fécamp example, the neum seems elongated, and that's simply because it's a modified virga rather than a modified punctum. That way of reading the sign is confirmed elsewhere in the Winchester troper, as here in a Gloria trope. The sign appears in this trope notation for semitones in different positions. So first for C above B, and then for F above E. Whereas in the Norman notations written post-conquest in the same book, the signification of the sign has changed to mi. And that is how the sign is used in post-conquest notations written at Christchurch, as here for the antiphon Introibo ad altare, sung in the ceremony for consecrating a church. This scribe wrote the mi sign for single notes, but he also incorporated it into the pays neum for two rising notes, as at the beginning of the antiphon for the step from E to F, and here in the antiphon et se tabernaculum Dei, where the first pays for the step of a tone from G to A is written in the usual way, while the second for the step of a semitone from B to C has a modified lower part. Now, I see that the way this is worked out, how the two signs relate, is not exactly the same as in the Catalan notations we just saw, but nevertheless, it's the same concept. We have to conclude that the change of signification of this sign from fa to mi in music notations written in England was made by the incoming Normans, and that it was also under Norman influence that the sign could be integrated into neumes for more than one note. This Christchurch notation must have been written in the 2 decades after 1070, but it's not possible to date it any more securely. Up to this point, all of the examples I've shown, leaving aside Ogenitrix, were written by scribes whose work is distinctly English or Norman. My next examples come from a book made at Christchurch in the 1080s, where, in contrast to the writing side by side of English and Norman notations, we see the earliest examples of a new style of notation, which can be followed through a series of other Canterbury examples written between the last decade of the 11th century and roughly 1130. This fine gradual was made at Christchurch and then given to the Durham community by its Bishop William of St. Calais. That it was written at Christchurch is assured on the basis of both liturgical content and paleography, with coloured display initials in a form characteristic of Christchurch. And in the Laudes Regiae, the saints invoked include Augustine, Dunstan, and Alphege, all archbishops of Canterbury, without references to abbots. And this can be explained quite easily, since at Christchurch the archbishop took the place of an abbot. Thus, even if I personally believe that the book was commissioned for Durham by William of St. Calais, it was demonstrably written at Christchurch by Christchurch scribes, and can therefore be used to continue the paleographical examination of new notational habits. Its tiny size, with a written space of just 105 by 65 millimeters, indicates that it was designed as a book for canto. And I urge you to think just how small that is. It's simply tiny. Some of the essential qualities of the new Christchurch music script can be seen in examples of notation previously written by Norman scribes at Canterbury. Above all, a commitment to using space between the text lines to the fullest possible extent. Hand in hand with this now very pronounced care for the positioning of neumes went a process of reconfiguration of neume forms. The older neumes written by English and continental scribes were often reshaped by the Cosin music scribe, so that the position of individual parts of the neume would correspond to specific positions on a vertical axis and thus relative pitches. So here I've shown a neume in a specific melodic situation as written in an older English notation, and that's the one at the top, and that's a notation written at some point in the first half of the 11th century. That's all that needs to be said now. And then you see the neume written in the same melodic situation as written in the Cosin gradual down over there. And here are two further examples of what I'm naming reconfiguration. So at the top you can see the older way of writing the porrectus neume for the pattern high, low, high, and beside it the way it was written for the pitches A, F, G in the Cosin gradual, with the note head representing the last of these pitches between the vertical levels of the first and second. So also for the second example, 4 notes in the pattern low, high. In this melody, the neume represented the pitches F, G, E, F, and the Cosin scribe wrote them in such a way as to show that the last note was on the same pitch level as the first. In this table, I've juxtaposed older English and Norman ways of writing 3 different neumes with the way those neumes are written in the Cosin gradual. The Cosin scribe still wrote the old form of neume for a series of notes, low, high, low, that's form I, but only when the pitch of the third note sat above that of the first. If the first and third notes were at an equal pitch level, then he wrote form J, and when the third note was lower than the first, he wrote form K. So there were 3 ways of writing the torculus neume. This same concern to clarify intervallic patterns determined the ways of writing the neume for the opposite pattern, high, low, high, the porrectus. Again, the Cosin scribe wrote this with regard to the relative pitch positions of the 3 notes, as in forms L, M, and N. In forms for 4-note neumes, for example, for the pattern low, high, he extended those same procedures. There is one other critical alteration in the notation written in this gradual. Now the note heads have become a dominant feature, rather than an element of script which represented something added to an older model, like serifs in text script. These notes are what Solange Gobin called petits carrés. The proportion of the note heads in relation to the surrounding space and all other script elements has been conspicuously increased as juxtaposition to the Norman notations in the Pontifical Corpus Christi College 44 at the top makes clear. In addition, almost every separate note sung is represented within a neume by a note head. So the example I've shown here is the clevis for 2 falling notes. It's not only squared at the top, but it also has a note head added at the bottom. The changeover from note heads as an element of visual aesthetic to note heads as the primary carrier of meaning is very apparent. This is still not a diastematic notation, but like that for Ogenitrix, the scribe has used the space available in an extremely careful way, so that successively different pitch levels are exposed. I included this slide so that you can appreciate the determination of the Cosin scribe to achieve that differentiation, given that he was working in a space of only 6 millimeters between text lines. It's extraordinary. I mean, his eyes must have been dying. Anyway, in an abstract sense, none of the techniques used in this new Christchurch notation are themselves novel. It's instead the way in which they are exploited, which is innovative. The combination of larger note heads with reconfigured neume shapes and careful positioning in relation to pitch takes this written representation of musical sound further away from the symbolic guide to moving melody provided by earlier pneumatic notations, driving it towards a simple written record of a series of pitches. The older way of reading neumes depended on a knowledge of a general meaning, such as 2 rising notes or 2 falling notes, or a rise followed by a fall. Those meanings had been represented symbolically. That dependence on knowledge of symbolic signs was now being abandoned. The writing of musical signs modified through a more iconic, physically based treatment of shape. It's worth noting that the neumes written in this new but non-diastematic Christchurch script, as at the bottom, were still being written more or less unchanged when the Christchurch scribes began to use stave lines. In other words, many of the ways in which we can see neumes reconfigured when written on lines, and which would often be considered as resulting from that transference to lines, were already in place in the Christchurch notations before the introduction of lines. To be able to see a process of change from writing neumes in campo aperto to writing them on lines as closely as is offered by the Christchurch records is extremely unusual. For neighbouring St. Augustine's, these are 2 St. Augustine's examples, all we can see is the dramatic jump from an insular music script, which offers a few avenues for clarification of intervals, to a notation written on lines. That's it. Between these 2 manuscripts, I have no examples. That's all you see. The changes observable in the Christchurch records involve a series of separate and not always related steps, all of which were in place before someone decided to rule lines. To summarize, first, the provision of note heads for some neumes, clarifying the position of the note they indicate. Then further modification, the application of note heads to even more parts of neumes and their enlargement. Third, the reconfiguration of neumes for more than 2 notes, clarifying the relative pitch relations of the notes they represent. Fourth, the use of mi signs to clarify the position of the semitone, and of course their incorporation into signs for more than 1 note. And fifth, the exploitation of the open space above the text to differentiate pitches to a degree far beyond earlier practice. All of these procedures remain within the realm of a non-diastematic approach to the record of melodies, acting to clarify information about relative pitch, whether that be through emphasis, the enlargement of note heads, or symbolic means, me signs, or iconicity, positioning of neumes, and reconfiguration of legated new forms. These techniques were used sometimes more, sometimes less by different scribes. In the notations written by a Norman-trained hand in Corpus Christi College 44, it was the me sign and exploitation of space above the text to clarify pitch which dominated, rather than note heads, even where these are present. In contrast, the notations in the cosin gradual used larger note heads to create an entirely new visual image of musical melody. But here, me signs were employed relatively rarely, generally only in the syllabic notations for sequences. These changes in attitude and practice were actively cultivated at Christ Church since the 1070s and may not have depended on knowledge of Guidonian music theory. Even when a series of Guidonian treatises were copied at Christ Church in the second quarter of the 12th century, the only notational element in the musical examples within those treatises which matched the model proposed by Guido was the grid of lines and spaces. In precisely that part of Guido's Regulae Rhythmicae treatise, where it is advised that clefs be used to mark the F and C lines, and that the F line should be inked in red and the C line in yellow, the Christ Church scribes followed their own practice. The lines were ruled with plummet, without any colouring, and the clefs they used were D and B natural, rather than Guido's F and C. It's entirely possible that the idea of a precise mapping of intervals across a written page came to England by a quite different route. For the idea of orientating neumes around a dry point line had already emerged in Aquitaine in the second quarter of the 11th century. In this kind of notation, the relation between a line written across the page and the neumes written around it was determined by mode, with the line positioned a third above the final for a chant in unauthentic mode. So here, the introit in virtute tua is classified in the authentic mode with G final, and hence the line traces the pitch level of B natural across the page. This kind of notation did not require clefs, since the critical difference between the various ecclesiastical modes is the position of semitone steps in relation to the final. But the ability to read this notation correctly did depend on a greater knowledge of music theory than Guido's lines and clefs. The Aquitanian notation also included a whole series of special neumes with further clarified specific behaviors like the step of a semitone. Interest in refining pneumatic notation to render them more intervallically precise was driving remodeling of notational practice in more than one European situation. If I was more together, I would have integrated Professor Tischler's Ripoll example here, because that was very interesting, the Ripoll 42, where the Guido Micrologos, the notation of those antiphon beginnings, I looked at it, and it is indeed in Aquitanian neumes, as you said, but there are no clefs, and you can't actually tell what's going on because the line, the pitch of the line is F, and that could be Guido, but it could also be an authentic mode, the third above the final. So it's at this point, I need to go and spend a bit of time with it. In any case, that is part of this complex of different ways of thinking at that point in the 11th century. Okay, some closing thoughts. The insufficiency of a historical model whereby scribes in different European institutions moved quickly from orality to literacy has long been questioned. In 2003, reacting to a remarkable diversity of notational methods in the notation of hymns from the 11th to the 12th century, Susan Boynton described the relation of oral and written traditions as coexisting in a relationship more complex than can be expressed by a polarity opposing orality and literacy. At Christ Church in Canterbury, scribes must have been well aware of a way of mapping space consistently from one side of a page to the other long before 1100, since the Musica and Scholica in Kyriades' treatises had been in their library since the late 10th century. It's in this manuscript. Yet it was not until the end of the 11th century that they began to use a grid of lines and spaces together with clefs. In the meantime, and quite intensively since 1066, those scribes were in the business of enhancing the information provided in their notations about the relative pitches of successive notes in melodies. And they may not have regarded the introduction of lines as a radical change, since when circa 1100 they moved over from neumes written in campo aperto to neumes written on lines, they went on writing exactly the same neume shapes. So I finish with two recommendations. First, that more detailed analysis of individual notations has the potential to provide a great deal of paleographical information to support dating of individual manuscripts. As long as there are starting points for dating manuscripts written in individual centres, this kind of work on musical notations can form a really useful part of a larger picture. And second, that in writing histories of musical notation, we should be wary of focusing simply on the introduction of lines. The Christ Church notations chart a process of modification rather than the fast abandonment of an orally based model. Viewed in the longue durée, the introduction of lines was just one step in an extensive process of change. Moreover, these alterations in notational habits did not emerge as successive linked refinements, but were the results of the separate actions of numerous musical scribes. To describe these innovations in the writing of musical notations in the late 11th century, I would rather think in terms of mentalité than sudden change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. Really thought-provoking, and I shall look at these notations with renewed interest now. I tend, of course, to focus on earlier materials because the irrigators much later, and relatively interesting actually, but actually all these minute details are really fascinating. Is there any question from the audience? Please.
The microphone, so I have the privilege to be the first. Okay, so thank you very much for your paper. It's very provoking, especially for the last part of your paper. And so I agree with you with your last sentence about the fact that maybe the stuff is just a step on a long durée progress about this thematic. And I also think that maybe in the future we should focus our research, for example, on the relation between Aquitanian and North Italy, because, for example, the repertoire of Aquitian tropes and sequences is extremely present in North Italian liturgical books. So why not thinking also that Aquitanian books circulated in North Italian region, and you know, as you explained us before, in the Aquitanian notation there is the dry point line, and maybe this could be, how to say, something that circulated in the networks and helped in maybe for Guido or other monks to rethinking about the stuff and line. So I think that this is a very good point that you suggest us.
I mean, of course, this would be very interesting if you go on with this. I mean, I'm always hoping that somebody's going to put Guido back in his box. Because I mean, you know, you can open recently published histories in musical notation and find Guido is the big story, and it's just not. But he's certainly part of something is going on in lots of places, and I imagine that one musically skilled person is going to recognize exactly what another musically skilled person is doing, you know, and they do it. I mean, there's lots of communication going on without us knowing much about it.
Thank you very much. Really wonderful paper. I don't want to take Guido out of his box, but the question of the mentalité that you raise at the end, that Guido's interested in chants you do not know, ignotus,
yes, of course, yes,
or you cannot see, I mean, in that sense. I'm very interested in a rubric in the Corpus Christi 44, which says, if you do not know this chant, sing this other chant. So my question to you is, was the development in notation a way of dealing with new chants that were coming in, rather than a maintenance of an older repertory?
Goodness, Jeremy, I mean, I don't know how to respond to that question. I think I need notice to think about that. Because after all, I mean, you know, each one of these theorists, and, you know, Hucbald, a good century before Guido, has got the same problem. That is, it's obviously been a problem for a long time. But I think that with, you know, Hucbald's in a kind of a complete morass of mess of how people sing things, and Calvin Bauer always taught me that you could not know that the third that somebody was singing in St. Gallen in 900 was the same third that somebody was singing in Paris at the same time. Whereas by the time you get lots of monochords, by the time you get to 1000, you can be much clearer about intervals. So I think Guido's in a slightly different position, and I'm sort of mixing things up a bit. But even if Guido was interested in people being able to sing new chants, what he actually wrote about was eventually used for everything. You know, it's where it all went eventually. So that I think there's just a lot more to the story than we've thought about. And you can see how frustrated I am with this simplistic history of musical notation, that there were neumes, and that was all one thing. And then there was notation on lines. And it's just not as, that really doesn't tell us very much.
No, but if we're talking about conquest.
But I agree to think about what was going on intellectually.
Yeah, but if you're talking about conquest as well, and the importation of new repertory and the need to learn new repertory, you've mentioned some of the pieces, whether that dislodged any residual, how can I say, loyalty to an older pneumatic system, that was also part of the mentalité that was going on.
Right. Well, that I can answer, but in a very small example. So it's very interesting to put Christchurch and St. Augustine's beside each other in exactly the same period. And you've just seen what happened at Christchurch. The Normans arrived, they all started changing, and they got a completely new music script, just like they got a new text script. At St. Augustine's, you have this one notator who I decided not to talk about today, but he's extremely interesting. He goes on writing that old English script up to the end of the century, and you can actually date. There are ways of absolutely precisely dating that notation after 1091, so you know it's late. And he kind of has a few kind of bits of clarification, but it's the old notation. He went on doing it the old English way even long after the Normans arrived. So in one city, you can do it two different ways. So everybody's going to do things the way they want to do them, but you know, you can be stubborn and obstinate and English. Or you could be somewhere that Langfranc had arrived and you have to change. You know, in other words, there isn't one answer.
Thank you. Perhaps I didn't good understand, but do you think in the Cotton Julius, the virga with a hook, in the Cotton Julius manuscript, the first manuscript, I saw, perhaps you told that.
Which manuscript?
Cotton Julius.
Cotton Julius. Go right back to the beginning. Yeah. Right, let's go back.
And do you think?
In the beginning, I'll get there. It's just the machine doesn't want to move too fast. I'm not. It'll get there. It's just
I saw it many times, but it's from Mont Saint-Michel.
Oh no, but I didn't. Oh, this
It's a big. Yes.
Mont Saint-Michel manuscript.
It's at the beginning.
We've gone past the Mont Saint-Michel manuscript, I think, haven't we?
It was at the beginning, and
But you want to talk about this manuscript, or that's Cotton Julius?
yes, this one, for example. At the,
Okay, right.
yeah.
Okay, right. I'll go back to something where you'll see
Yeah,
it. Right.
is the virga at the third line, the second line, for example, would it be taken from the Aquitanian manuscripts, virga with a hook, celsa, on parentem? Do you think it could be taken from?
No, I actually, I have to say, I haven't really worked on what that might mean. But you're quite right. That's one of the neumes in this that deserves a bit of attention. But since I don't know what the note is, what's going on, I don't actually know what's behind it, and I just didn't go that far. I haven't worked on that.
Because it's very close from Aquitanian system
Yeah,
with Quilisma,
to the
indicating
Aquitanian
the high level, the semitone.
No, I see that. I have no other example that goes with this. I've got nothing to compare it with within England, so it's actually quite different. I mean, it's obviously, it's a Norman notator, and he may well have learnt that from Aquitaine, and you're quite right. I should do something with that, but it was a detail beyond which.
Perhaps you could join your question about repertory of sequences or tropes with the influence of Aquitanian repertory and notation.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think there's a lot of Aquitanian material. I mean, not just Aquitanian ideas about notation, but there's Aquitanian repertory which came to England. So there's clearly a straightforward link.
Thank you so much. And of course, I would like to talk a little bit about the minium, of course. But let's see if I can contextualize more, because, I mean, so from In Campo Aperto 2 lines, I would like to, introduce also the event of the development of the gamut, of the diatonic scale, octave bass scale, in which all the notes are laid out. The notes to be used are laid out. So the relationship with the minium, when we have a gamut, when we have a set of notes, okay, the minium just indicates where the semitone is, right? But I found also other cases in earlier sources when probably the gamut wasn't laid off, so they used to indicate a sort of, if I can use the term, a modal change. I don't know if you found something about this, or
that I do not have. I mean, the connection of the minium with the semitone is really clear, because, and you probably find this as well, not just B to C and E to F, but also A to B flat, and that's, you know, absolutely standard, and it often tells you just what's going on in a song. But I haven't, well, thinking about all the notations that I've looked at, I haven't found anything. Okay, earlier English manuscripts, I'm very unlikely to find it in, because there's not much of it. In any case, it's a phoneme. But earlier, I think one has to start digging in the 10th century, and that is something I have not personally done.
if I can just add one little thing.
Yes.
The fact is that I found one example also in a 12th century source, where in the same chant we find a B, a natural B, and a B flat in the same chant. And where the B flat is, we have the minium. So it would be maybe the case also in one of these.
Yes, yeah. This depends on the cantor, the scribe. really understanding those issues, and they didn't all, I think, is the point. But I mean, all I can say is please, write about this. We'd like to know, because there's very little. I mean, when you think about the fact that the Minu bibliography is all about the 12th century, whereas here we are, we're finding it long before that. So there's much more to be done.
I just want to go back very briefly to your conclusions. I think it was absolutely very exciting to hear that within a particular context, it is actually possible to use notation in order to support the dating of a manuscript. I think it's fascinating. It's also because I tend to be very careful about that, and about dating neumes and about using neumes for dating the script. But if you find the right context and the right center, and of course you compare different stages of production of music manuscripts within that particular center, it makes perfect sense, and it's just very reassuring to hear, I suppose. That's what I want to say. So this is more of a comment. Then the question is, have you encountered any case for which, in the lack of staff lines, we could still think that the scribe... I'll start again. Can we interpret some cases as an originally trained scribe with staff notation using the same parameters but without system of lines? In other words, an adiastomatic notation because of the absence of parallel lines, but actually a diastomatic notation in terms of its conception and its original use. So what we are looking at here, for example, of course you demonstrated that this is actually a very early... Sorry?
That doesn't work, as you saw.
Sorry,
as you saw.
Oh, okay, but in any case, what I am tempted sometimes to start thinking when I see sources like this is, are we looking at a very early stage in this kind of movement from adiastomatic to diastomatic, or are we looking at a scribe who's accustomed to writing on staff, but in this particular case is just not using the system of lines for economy or any other reason?
About this particular example, I mean, I was so sure it had to be on lines, and I went back to the manuscript more than once to assure myself that there really aren't lines. And then, of course, I was astonished when I did those transcriptions. So I don't think it would be... You have to do a lot of... I mean, if you start looking at individual points here, I think what you're suggesting doesn't quite work, because if you were to compare the ends of... if you go through this and you look at individual moments in the melody, it never quite works. To give an example.
Yes. Really work.
If it was the way you're suggesting, it might have been that he was used to writing on lines. It would have been more consistent. And it's just not consistent. So he doesn't. That is, I would say, his mentality, his concept is not that is one pitch.
Right.
He's not. He's just. I mean, what he's doing, as all new scribes before lines did, is working in groups and just it's from one to the next. But it's not. The space is not rigidly mapped. Very difficult to make that work. But there might be what you're suggesting.
Well, I think perhaps. Anyway, any other questions or comment? This wonderful keynote, and it's very, very exciting. And thank you all for this marvelous first day of the conference. A great round of applause for everybody. I just want to thank staff. And I just want to say that those of you who are coming to the dinner is 7:30 at the restaurant Settecento. Okay, you just write it on your Google Map. Settecento. It's S-E 700. Yeah. S-E C-E. Oh, but you.